Good morning, afternoon and evening all, this is Yorkie, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to do a final, basically conclusion episode for my in-depth track guide series. Last week was the final track at Brazil. It was the last track on the F1 calendar that I completed, but as you know, the series took quite a while, as I was basically doing one episode per week, which meant at least 20 weeks have gone by since I started the very first episode back in Silverstone. And as you can imagine, in that time, as I've been playing the game and experimenting with different setups, quite a large number of the setups for different tracks, especially the tracks earlier on in the calendar, would have changed. So, for this final conclusion, what I thought I'd do is walk you through the setup for F1 2012 and also give an update on all the setups that I have. So, basically, for the whole setup screen, as a purpose, we have aerodynamics, braking, balance, suspension, gearbox, and alignment, and then an option to load and basically save setups, which is what I have done for every single track. I've got a dry race. I haven't done a wet one yet, but I have a dry and then basically use that as a basis for my wet track, for a wet track. So the setups themselves, basically for every single track the car has a basic setup already applied. There's a window in which the setups, the settings actually operate in. This is on a track by track basis, I believe, but don't fully quote me on it. I'm not 100% sure. But it's the only reason why I can think that people are running 1-1 wings in places like Monaco, where it's an extremely high downforce track. Obviously, you should be running much higher wings, but they don't. So the only way I can think about it actually working is it's done on a track-by-track basis. This is further backed up by people saying that gearing ratios or standard gearing ratios for tracks are out. They're either too short or too long. So we'll give an overview of every single section, starting with aerodynamics. So in here we have both a front wing angle and rear wing angle. They range from options 1 to 11. That's pretty much follows throughout the entire setup, apart from obviously gear ratios, camber, and also some braking things, but you'll see them as we come to them. So basically, front wing angle, generally the lower the wing angle is, the higher the straight line speed you have, but less downforce. The higher the front wing angle is, the more downforce you have, but also that increases the amount of drag you have, therefore less straight line speed. Obviously you want to get a balance of this, so we'll be looking for somewhere on most tracks. So we're at Melbourne at the moment, so for Melbourne I tend to run a 3, which will give me some good downforce in the higher speed sections, but also keep my straight line speed up relatively high. And as for rear, it works pretty much in the same way, but obviously there's a less of effect, as the front wing actually affects the airflow across the rest of the car. So higher downforce on the rear will give much more downforce in the rear of the car, and lower will give you slightly more understeer. Generally, I tend to run to match the front wing angle or run it down a slight notch. This will give me slightly more straight line speed. It will reduce the amount of drag going over the rear wing, and yeah, because there's a minimal factor, it doesn't really matter too much. So moving on to braking. Balance is basically the amount of brake pressure you're applying to either the front or the rear. So you can put it up to a maximum of 60% on the front with 40% on the rear, or you can put 60 on the rear and 40% on the front. The further you put it in either direction will lock up whichever brake pads have the most pressure, as it were. So if I was to stick it all the way to the front, there'll be a much greater chance of me locking the front brakes, as they will be doing all the work and the rear brakes will be doing less. Same applies to the rear, but obviously rear brakes locking often tend to put you in a spin. So you want to end up roughly in the mid-mark, roughly 50-50. I tend to run a 49-51. This will give me basically a little bit more braking on the rear, which helps to reduce the amount of front brake locking, whilst also trying to maintain a lot of the stopping power that you get from the front brakes, as the front brakes are larger than the rear. The lowest setting that I run is 47-53. This is a kind of setting that I'll be running on a track like Bahrain, where you got the horrible turn 9 and 10, which is a relatively heavy braking zone whilst also turning. Basically, putting slightly more rear brake balance will help in basically slowing the car down whilst also turning at the same time, whilst avoiding locking the front wheels. So pressure is basically the amount of application that the brake pads will apply to the brake discs. So the higher the pressure, the greater the application is. You'll be able to brake harder and also later. However, this does increase the chance of you locking the front wheels or rear wheels, depending on where you have the brake balance. And obviously, the lower the pressure, the basically the less application goes to the brake pads, which will increase your stopping distance. Basically, you have to brake a whole lot earlier. Generally, pressure, I'll run medium pressures for wet tracks, and then higher pressures for 90% of the dry tracks. Tracks like Monaco, where there's a lot of bumps and it's very easy to lock the wheels, I'll put a medium pressure on, just decrease the chance of locking the brakes ever so slightly. So brake size, you got small brake discs, standard brake discs, and large brake discs. The larger the brake discs, the more weight you have, but also with that, the more stopping power that you have. So small, you'll be quick, nice and light. However, you'll have to brake earlier because you have longer stopping distances, and the opposite for large. Generally, I keep it on standard. I don't really tend to fiddle with the brake size too much. I haven't actually played around or experimented at all that much with brake pressures, or brake sizes, sorry. So, moving on to balance. Basically, the higher the brake balance is, the higher the anti-roll bar balance is. This is the stiffness of the anti-roll bars. The higher it is, the greater the turn-in that you'll have, but obviously you'll have less cornering grip, which means as you basically continue to turn throughout a corner over an extended period of time, the less grip you'll have. So for say turn 5 and 6 of Malaysia, the two long sweeping left-handers that goes into the right, initially my car will be very responsive turning into that corner, but as I continue throughout that corner, I'll start to get more understeer and I'll slowly start to pull away from the inside curb. So countering that, the front balance, the anti-roll bar balance, the softer it is, the more grip we'll have, but obviously the less responsive the car is, the longer it takes to actually turn in. So your initial, for that example again, your initial turn-in will be relatively slow, but you'll have plenty of cornering grip, which means you can attack the corner midway through quite aggressively. Your car will come in and basically a less understeer. I generally prefer a car with a lot of turn-in. I like it to be very responsive, so for 90% of the tracks I'll be running something similar to a 910, as putting it all the way up will give me a little bit too much tyre wear, as this does affect tyre wear quite drastically. And for a track like Malaysia, I'll probably run a 7.8, which will give me a reasonable amount of turn-in, which I like, but obviously also help me get through those longer sweeping corners and maintain that speed. So suspension, the first two settings are the ride heights, and then second two, or third and fourth setting, are spring stiffness. So front ride height, generally the lower the ride height, the lower the car is to the ground, the higher your straight line speed is, the more downforce you have. The higher the ride heights are, the slower the car will be, and it also kind of gives you less downforce. It does also affect the softness of the springs. But generally, for I would say about 80% of the tracks that I run, I'll be using a ride height of 1. And for some tracks with high curbs, so like Singapore, I'll be riding a ride height of 2, which means I can attack those curbs a bit more aggressively without the car bottoming out as I run over them. And then for Monaco, generally I run a 3-3, once again just prevent myself from bottoming out. Also give me slightly softer suspension, help me deal with all the bumps of the streets, which will also help in preventing the brakes from locking. So moving on to stiffness now. The stiffer the car is, the more turn-in and response you'll have. But obviously less cornering grip. It basically works in exactly the same way as the balance with the front and rear anti-roll bars. So the softer suspension, obviously the more mid-cornering grip we have, but less response. Also, to work alongside this, softer suspension generally helps to basically take the cushion coming off the bumps and also curbs. McLaren in real life tend to run a very, very stiff setup, which is what I also like to run. Obviously, running something like this will give me a lot of good initial turn-in, but I'll probably decrease it ever so slightly. Basically for like bumps in Monaco, like the horrible kink left-hander after the chicane coming out of the tunnel. That little left-hander just before the swimming pool section, everyone knows there's a nasty bump on the apex of that. Softening the suspension for that ever so slightly will decrease the chance of you getting oversteer. So also to further explain this on a track, again, like Malaysia, I'll probably run a softer suspension setup, and then for somewhere like Melbourne or Silverstone, or actually not Silverstone, but Melbourne and a couple of other tracks, I'll run a much stiffer spring stiffness. I can also use this in balance with the anti-roll bars, so you can have much softer anti-roll bars and then much stiffer spring stiffness. This will give basically the best of both worlds. So for Malaysia, I could do something, say like a 9-10, and then do much softer anti-roll bars like a 5-6, something like that, and it'll still give me the good turn-in that I need, and also the corner and grip that I'll need for those long sweeping corners. So moving on to gearbox now. Generally, the lower the gear ratio, the more acceleration you have. The higher the gear ratio, the better your top speed. So for Monaco, you'll tend to run much lower gear ratios. For a track like Monza, where straight line speed is very important, you'll run much higher gear ratios. I personally tend to keep something along this sort of line. Basically, you want to keep a nice flow or patterned curve with your gear ratios, as large gaps will mean basically a general drop in revs, and the revs kind of fall out of sync. So I was to have actually, if I was to have a much longer gear 7, yes, you can run a lot more speed in gear 7. However, the difference from shifting up to gear 7 will be huge. Your revs will drop an awful lot, and basically the amount you accelerate in the mid-range revs in gear 7 will be a lot slower than if it was further back. The ratios were closer together. So you want to keep a curve. Generally, this is what I use for most tracks. You just about hit top speed in rich fuel mixtures with this sort of settings. That's without DRS. If you know you're going to get DRS, you can knock it up a couple of notches. Basically, just give you that little bit more straight line speed. But obviously, the higher the ratios, the less acceleration you have. Finally, moving on to alignment. Two things here. We've got camber and toe. A lot of people kind of don't really understand how this works. So Basically an overview of camber. A camber is the amount the wheels lean in or out towards the car. So if I was to have a lot of camber in, the wheels, or the top part of the wheels, would lean in towards the car. This would mean that the actual contact patch with the car on the straight line would be along the basically it would be relatively small, be along the inner edge of the along the inner part of the tyres, and this for straight line speed is very, very good. It gives you obviously less surface contact, which means less friction and higher speed, and also means when you come into corners, as the balance of the car shifts, so say if I was turning left, the balance of the car will shift to the right, the weight would lean on the right hand side of the tyre, and as it did that, the inside left will become unloaded, all the load goes onto the right, and as you're leaning on the tyre, the actual tyre width, the whole of it will be in contact with the track itself. And obviously for cornering, the more contact you have with the surface of the track, the more grip you have. This works in conjunction with the rear. The more camber that you have leaning in, obviously the less contact that you have with the surface. So if you want a lot of traction, you'll leave it more towards the default setting, as obviously it'll give you more contact surface with the track, give you better traction, but also you got to also counteract this for when coming out of corners, because obviously you have more traction on one wheel than you will on the other. So to explain toe is the angle at which the wheels point in or outwards towards the car. So whereas camber is kind of a vertical angle, toe is horizontal. So to have toe in would mean that the front two tyres, the front edge of the wheel, if you were to look at it side on, the closest part to the front wing, would point inwards towards the front of the nose. If you were to have toe out, it would mean that those tyres point outwards to the ends of the wings and the end fend plates. Generally, toe can be left as default. However, for tracks that are very tight and twisty, like Monaco, I tend to often run a more toe out setting. This will give more response, basically increase the amount of cornering grip. So that's an overview of the car setup. What I'll do is I'll link in the description below a link to my blog where I'll post all of my updated car setups. Obviously there's 20 tracks to get through, and this video is already running quite long, so to basically keep it under relatively short, and also make it very easy for you guys to actually look at and bring up in kind of a hurry just before a race, make it very easy to read. I'll basically put it on my blog, on my website. You guys can view it there. I'll leave that link in the description below. But yeah, that is my conclusion to the in-depth track guide series. Hopefully this guide and this entire series itself has actually been extremely useful to you guys. I know in a lot of comments that you guys have been very impressed by it and are very, very grateful, and it's fantastic to see that you guys are learning a lot from this series. I did intend on making this probably the most in-depth series there is for F1 2012, as there's quite a few large names who do their own track guides but only just really do the hot lap. I thought it'd be a great idea to do braking points and also the apex, is basically just break each track down, show you in more depth and more detail so you can see exactly what's going on and hopefully learn from that. But yeah, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this series. Please give it a rating. If you have any more comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Obviously check out the website. Also check out my Tumblr. I do have a Tumblr. It's basically I'm using it as a Q&A sort of site. So if you want to ask me any sort of questions related to anything, feel free to post the question there. I shall reply on that as soon as I can. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. I hope to see you soon. Take care.